Immanuel Kant, deontology. Now, suppose you had a situation where you had 5 people that could be saved if they got an organ transplant, and another person that was perfectly healthy, that if the doctor killed that person, they could take the organs and save 5. So you're talking about, would you kill the one person to save 5 people, or let the 5 people die in order not to kill the one person? So, just think for a minute, how does each choice make you feel? What is right with each choice, and what is wrong with each choice? What principles or ethical reference do you seem to be making? So just pause the video, think about that for a minute. You might want to write down any conclusions. One principle might be that there are certain things that just are wrong, and you should never do them. For example, thou shalt not kill could be an example of that. And from that position, it doesn't matter what the consequences are. If whatever is right or whatever is true harms you, it doesn't matter. You still have to do what's right and what's true. The end result, the other position, the opposite position, is that it's the end result that matters. It's not a thing that is right or wrong. It's the situation, and it's the good of the outcome. So you can commit evil as long as good comes out of it. So the ends can justify the means. One example, if you like, Dune versus Lord of the Rings. If you haven't seen these movies, just listen for a second. But it provides, I think, a fun example. In Dune, Paul has the ability to see the future, and what he does is comes up with a plan that will save billions of people, but by him causing billions of deaths. So he does a calculus and he decides to do something that's going to kill billions of people, but he knows that it will result in more people being saved. Lord of the Rings, they're confronted with a situation that's near impossible. They need to destroy a ring. They need to destroy it in the heart of the enemy's lands. There is no confidence in the practical outcome working out, but they do it anyway. They time and time again go into situations where they have little chance of success, and they do it because it's the right thing to do. Evil needs to be fought. I always go back to dictionary definitions of key words. So deontology, what does that mean? Deon, meaning duty. Ontology, meaning science. So you're sort of the study of duty, or the science of duty, or the logic of duty. Some quotes that might help articulate this position. Morality is not properly the doctrine of how we make ourselves happy, but how we make ourselves worthy of happiness. So the happiness doesn't matter. It's just the idea of being a decent person, in a sense, might make you feel that it is you are justified in being happy. Duty is for duty's sake. In other words, you're not doing something, you're not carrying out a duty for a reason outside of just doing the duty. It's just the right thing to do. Virtue is its own reward. If the truth shall kill them, let them die. Okay. The first thing we have to consider is the judgment rational? Is an ethical decision a rational decision? Would you want to make an important decision being your most rational self, or would you rather be irrational? If someone were to judge you on an ethical matter, would you rather them to be rational, logical, or irrational? Do you have any ability to tell if you or others are rational? Okay, so built in to all, what is your intuition on all these matters? I think intuitively we know that the best way to make a serious, important decision is to be the most rational person we can be. And then the second thing is we would want others to treat us in the most rational way. So that gives us an idea of how ethics might be related to rationality. So, as we've talked about before, a lot of ethical systems rely on a claim about human nature. What is best for humans as a species is going to be a claim that grounds the philosophical ethics. In this case, Kant, as well as others, proposes that the distinctive quality of the human species is its rationality. We have an intuition that being more rational helps us to navigate the world better. We make better decisions. The outcomes are typically better. We have an intuition that allows us to recognize what is rational and what is not. So no proof is actually needed for this claim. So Kant is not saying, I can prove that humans are best when they're, at their most rational. He's going to say everyone intuitively knows this if they're honest. If the best quality of human nature is our rationality, then our best ethical judgments are probably the rational judgments, the most rational judgments as well. Let's look again at the dictionary. What is reason? What is rationality? It's a process of logic. What is logic? A logic is if there is an assumed true premise, then a conclusion necessary follows. So if all cats are evil and Garfield is a cat, then Garfield must be evil. An invalid claim on all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. Okay. Invalid would be all fish are mortal, Socrates is immortal, therefore Socrates is a fish. It doesn't follow from that. Socrates is not a fish. So your logic is an absolute association between one thing and another thing. So a following thing is inevitable from the first thing. Reason is universal. It's across all situations, across all time. For example, 1 on 1 equals 2 is true in any country, any culture, at any time. It doesn't change. It doesn't depend on your subjective experience, your emotions, your intuitions, your language, your beliefs. It just is. On contrast is something that is not universal. That would be situational, idiosyncratic, irrational, and the claim there would be many truths. Everyone has their own truth, many natures. There's no single thing to be found out. So, for Kant then, ethics needs to be, if it's going to be rational, it needs to be universal. Much like the laws of gravity. In other words, the laws of gravity don't change. They're not different between you and I. And in one situation or another, one time or another, in one culture or another. It's got to be an absolute universal law. So the categorical imperative is the term used for Kantian ethics, and it really implies the rationality and logic implied. Or it speaks of the rationality and logic, implied in the ethic. So, for example, it is categorically true that someone who has given birth must be a woman, because only women can give birth. In the dictionary, something called categorical is defined as absolute and unqualified. In other words, it must be, it has to be. There is no situational element to it. So, what is an ethical law? He calls it a maxim. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. So, what is the maxim? Can it be universalized? If it can be, then it is a duty and the action is moral. If it's not, if it cannot be universalized, it is not a duty and the action is not moral. I'm not sure if he means that it's immoral, but you can't ground the claim that you know for certain that it is ethical. So how do you do this? Modern philosophies are basically procedural. There's steps. If you carry out the steps, no matter who you are, then you're being ethical. Now, as opposed to ancient ethics, virtue ethics, the idea with virtue ethics is, how do you know you're being ethical? You're the most virtuous and capable person to make that decision in any situation. And so it's assumed that that decision is going to be the most ethical possible. In this case, it's not the person and the virtue of the person, it's the virtue of the process. So the first step in the process is to interrogate the rationality of the ethical agent. Is the ethical agent willing and capable of being rational? People can choose to be selfish and irrational. If so, are they flawed in some sense? Are they biased or selfish? Are they emotional, fearful? Are they impulsive? Have overwhelming appetites? Have a particular interest? Let's say financial interest. Are they managing their confirmation bias and groupthink like we talked about earlier in the class? If so, can anything be done to manage or mitigate that irrationality or bias? One way of doing that is to go into, talk to other people, and just like we talked about before, the Socratic method, a good critical dialogue will help people to question their own assumptions and their own interests, and other people will allow them to see themselves much better, and then maybe they can manage that. And furthermore, in that dialogue, you're going to get additional information which helps you to be more, biased, and additional views and additional logic from other people. You could go through a process to mitigate your biases. For example, there's a bias in the law talked about, that's recognized in law, addressed by rules about hearsay. In other words, unless someone directly heard something themselves, testimony about having heard somebody else say they saw something is not allowed, because that sort of testimony is very weak and people have a tendency or bias to believe that. So the rule is not to allow that, because we know of our weakness. If the ethical agent has a bias, or you don't have a lot of confidence in managing that bias, then you might want to move the decision to someone that does not have an axe to grind, that is capable of being unbiased and rational. One thing that you want to check is the ethic based on the intention and not the consequence. So the idea is, this is an ethic of intentions. If you have goodwill, if you are willing that the good thing happens, then that is really enough. People cannot control outcomes, only intentions. So that's the only thing people, can be ethical or unethical about. It doesn't matter how many evil consequences there are. And if your intentions are not good, it doesn't matter how many good things are of consequence. An ethical act is simply good in itself. There's no other value in it. Okay. Some act that is done because you enjoy, let's say, seeing yourself as an ethical person. If you do that good thing because you enjoy that feeling of that identity, that is actually not ethical. Even though you're doing the right thing and the good thing, your intention is actually to enjoy the self-image of being a good person and not just doing your duty for duty's sake itself. Is it okay ever to lie? Kant would say, I'm not. I'm going to have to look into this further, but Kant is typically understood as arguing that there are certain things that you simply cannot do under any circumstance, and one of them is lying. And his justification of that is that if everyone was allowed to lie, depending on the situation and their advantage, then actually speaking at all would be undermined, because no one would ever believe anyone else. So the rule or ethic has to be that you should tell the truth. And of course, if that ethic is rational, then it's got to be universal, it's got to be absolute. There can be no circumstances in which you tell a lie, and that's okay. Now, another aspect of Kant is he talks about not only how to step by step make an ethical decision, or decide if a decision is ethical. You also have to think about the people involved. People are the ethical agents. Without them, you have no ethics. So you sort of have to, protect them and their interests and consider them. That has to be part of the ethic. So one thing that the ethical agent needs to be able to do is to have free choice to make the ethic, or to choose to be ethical or not. So in this case, free choice does not mean your ability to just indulge your tastes or preferences. I like cake, you like apples, whatever. Freedom to choose, whatever you want. Rather, freedom is the opportunity to do what's necessary. In terms of ethics, everything is absolute, according to Kant. So freedom of choice is not the freedom to choose how you want to pursue an ethic. It's the freedom. It's the freedom to be able to do what is necessary. So, for example, if I'm a father and I lose my job, I lose my freedom to do what's necessary, which is to support my family. Okay? And if I got my job back, then I had the freedom. I could choose at that point not to support my family and indulge myself or something like that. But given the fact that I now have a job, I can make that choice. And so that choice, if I do make it, that would be an ethical choice. I think a lot of times people think of freedom as simply indulging whatever tastes they have, but that is not the case here. So does the moral agent have a choice? If someone is forced to do the right thing or is bribed to do the right thing, that still isn't being ethical, even if it's the right thing. The intention is not there. The free choice is not there, and the intention is not there. So workers may not be able to make an ethical choice because they simply don't have the power to do that. They may be fired. Some stakeholders simply don't have the resources. In other words, like someone that's uneducated, someone that's poor, wouldn't be able to, identify the choices and then choose, in order to make that. Okay, now ethics is, of course, grounded in people. So part of the ethic is to encompass the welfare of those people. You need to consider all of the stakeholders involved, all the people involved. Does the ethic take into account what they need to survive and thrive? And the idea here is, or the principle is, are you treating others just as an object, or are you also considering their needs and interests? So always recognize that human individuals are ends and do not use them as means to your end. Okay, so here is a good kind of sketch of the decision-making process for deontology. Over here, am I acting from the basis of, on the left, of reason alone? Can you rule out various influences? If yes, go ahead and make the decision. If not, then defer to other people or groups. You can talk. We talked before about the Socratic dialogue, and then you can have a group consensus. You might want to find a third party, someone that simply doesn't have any axe to grind, and let them either help you make the decision or have them make the decision. And then finally, whatever decision you make, this suggests that would you obligate everyone who was ever in a similar situation to do the same thing? Would you accept this decision if you were on the receiving end? Have you faced a similar ethical issue, before? So that's, I think it's a fair idea of how a Kantian would approach an ethical decision. All right, let's talk about utilitarianism, consequentialism. And this philosophy of ethics developed really around the time science began to change the world. So the 1600s, 1700s, when you had people like Newton and you had a lot of basic scientific discoveries, and people could see the value of that way of thinking. And so it's a way of looking at the world that you can see is effective, is impressive, it changes the world, it gives you a lot of power. And so that whole idea of being rational and scientific and gathering evidence and weighing evidence and things like that became much more authoritative than the alternative. Historically, you would believe things because an authority said it. You know, somebody in the church said it, a Lord said it, your father said it, a revered book said it. But in this case, the idea is to go out and investigate the world and test your ideas. So you're just going to propose ideas. What science does is it proposes a model of how the world works and then it tests it. It does that by being as rational as possible. So any theory that you have has to be tested with evidence. You have a blind peer review, meaning that others have to read your paper that you don't know and have to approve of the logic and of the evidence. Furthermore, science is not just one study. It's a mistake journalists make all the time. So if a study is published as saying something that no good scientist is going to say, well, then that's the truth. That's the end of it. They're going to expect a lot more studies on the matter and for people to change their minds about it. Okay. So there's this new idea of how to approach the world that's authoritative, and that becomes a rational justification for ethics. So the idea is, how can we build a rational explanation for what is ethical or what is not? Now, utilitarian ethics emerged in an atmosphere where the old authorities based on tradition needed to be challenged. So a new authoritative reference or benchmark needed to be created. And so the idea was to mimic science to develop that. One difference between science and tradition is that tradition works, very slowly, trial and error over generations, whereas utilitarianism is mimicking science in the sense that you would do an analysis and figure out how to make the world better now. You would want to see an ethical idea is not just doing something that is traditional and accepted, but doing something where you're looking at the results or consequences. Do things get better? That's an ethical thing. Just following a tradition, a traditional ethic is not ethical. It's actually doing something that actually improves things. Now, this is in part a political move because it allows them at the time to criticize the institutions at the time based on aristocracy and based on a tradition. So it allows, for example, the elimination of royal patronage, an extension of the franchise, annual elections by secret ballot, the election of intellectually qualified and independent members of parliament, with a system of fines to ensure regular attendance and the accurate and regular publication of parliamentary debates. So what they would argue is that if we do those things, the system's going to get better. If the law or action doesn't do any good, then it isn't any good. The word utility, if you look it up, the state of being useful, profitable, or beneficial. Overall, utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. It is good if the outcome is good. Okay, so in a sense, it's really a balance, or the overall balance of what the outcomes will be, what is good and what is harmful. In a sense, you can do something harmful if you can argue that the overall good will be better. So in this case, this ethic, the ends do justify the means. So if you need to kill lots of people in order to free more people, then it's perfectly justified. One principle is to look at everyone, and many modern theories take a very strong view on equality of the worth and value of individuals, whereas traditional society felt that some classes were better than others, like the blue bloods, the aristocracy were just better people. Gentlemen and ladies were better than peasants. And so you would there's more moral value in traditional culture for that, for an aristocrat. Whereas in modern theories, everyone is treated as being equally valuable. So one question you would ask for utilitarian ethics is, when you're evaluating the interests of people involved, are you evaluating their interests as all equally valuable? Is the ethical agent, again, disinterested? In other words, do they have a bias, an axe to grind? If they do, then they should probably not be making this ethical judgment. You would decide based on an overall good versus harm ratio, or cost-benefit analysis, in a sense. So in a sense, ethics is quantitative. It's the number of people involved. The greatest good for the greatest number. There's also the magnitude of the good or harm that are done. How many people are harmed? How many people are hurt? How much are people helped? How much are people harmed? And then the probability. Well, if we were to do this, what's the likelihood of that harm? What's the likelihood of that good? And then you can do a calculation. All right, there's two kinds of utilitarianism. One is act utilitarianism, and this is going to be situations, making an individual decision in an individual situation. So if you think about it, when you and your friends have to decide what to do, if there's conflicting interests or preferences, what do you typically do? What kind of things do you consider? Let's say there's 5 or 6 people involved. What seems to be a compelling moral argument to decide what the group as overall, what should they do? One thing you might want to take into account is how many people want the thing, how many people oppose it, how many people really strongly want it, how many people really strongly oppose it. And then maybe question whether that's really the case. Someone, may not find it so terrible, or someone may not find it so great. So the probability of that outcome. So act utilitarianism is for a situation. You're making an individual situational decision. And so the questions are, is the individual decision maker unbiased? Do they have no axe to grind? Who are the stakeholders or the people impacted by the decision? What are the goods or harms? Utilitarianism, that's going to be called a util. A util is a definition of the good and harm and also how to measure that. So what you want to do is not only define what the goods and harms are, but you want to be able to count it. It has to be something observable and easily counted, and everyone has to have access to that. Again, very similar to science. You're going to want replication. You're going to want to be able to replicate somebody's study. Go out and gather your own data and make sure that the study was done properly. So there are different types of utils. You could decide, well, it's pleasure or pain. It's peace or strife. You can use objective criterion, whether people, are health or sick, whether they go to the hospital or not, how many hospital visits, how many died, how many lived. You can have preferences, whether people, are happy with the service or not happy with the service. Then it has to be measurable. In other words, it has to be a thing that anyone can easily measure themselves, easily observe, and you need to define how you're going to measure that. So if you want to gather health data, you could do that in different ways, maybe hospital records, or you could do a survey as well. Then you need to evaluate the magnitude of the good and harm. So if the good for one person is to be stronger or be able to run further, and the bad for other people is for them to be crippled, the magnitude of the harm far exceeds the good. And then there's a probability of good or harm. Sometimes we're not sure if there's going to be a good or harm outcome, and you want to estimate that too. So the overall calculation would be the benefit times the magnitude of benefit times the probability. And then you want to weigh that against the harm times the magnitude of the harm times the probability. So here is the procedure. Is the decision maker unbiased? What are the utils? Who is helped or harmed? Are they all treated equally? How much are they helped or harmed? Magnitude. What is the probability of being helped or harmed? What is the overall balance of helped and harmed? Different types of utils: hedonistic, preferential, ideal, objective. You can pause this and read it if you want to. This might be an example of a very simple way of doing it. Sort of, almost like a spreadsheet. You assign weights to it. You assign numbers to it. So you're looking at an overall balance of positive, negative. So here's an example from the puppies and the roommate example. What are the utils? Utils are likes the idea of the puppy or hates the idea of the puppy. What's measured? Feelings about keeping the dog. I'm not saying this is a perfect example, but measured by, how do you measure? You measure by asking people whether they, want the dog and how much. Then you estimate the number of people in each position and the magnitude and probability. One person wants the puppy, magnitude high, very passionate, probability high. One person harmed by the puppy, or claims they will be harmed by the puppy. The magnitude is high, very passionate, probability very high. They're absolutely certain. Two others lean towards removing the puppy, magnitude low, they don't care that much. Probability moderate, we're not sure if they're going to feel that way afterwards. and then one leans towards keeping the puppy. Overall, there's a slightly negative calculation to the outcome. So you're taking number of people times the magnitude and then calculating the probability. So you get a scoring here, positive or negative, and then you calculate the probability, and then finally you're going to have an overall outcome. So for example, drugs, every drug you take is going to tell you there are possible harmful side effects. An ordinary aspirin can kill you. So everything is a risk. What are the harms and benefits? Outsourcing work to other countries. What are the harms and benefits? Well, it'll lower costs, allows lower prices, which is very good for a lot of people. But the harms might be reduced domestic job opportunities, lower domestic wages, problems in coordinating work with other cultures, time zones, fewer face-to-face opportunities. And so you have to weigh those two things. Using AI to reduce labor costs. You can reduce costs, prices, increase profits, allows companies to remain competitive. If they don't take on AI, they may go out of business. But of course, the harms are job loss. A lot of people lose their jobs. And a company that has fewer entry-level employees may not be able to develop leadership for the future. There's another way of approaching this. It's called rule utilitarianism. It's not based on a particular situation. It's really a decision that an entire group or organization or society would adopt, feeling that this rule will make things better. In other words, again, the harms and good would be calculated, but instead of deciding what to do in a particular situation and act, you would decide what rules should society or the group or the organization live by to create a better outcome. And if you do that, that's being ethical, because you're creating a better outcome for the group as a whole. So rule utilitarians focus on the effects of actions that stem from certain rules or moral guidelines. For example, the Golden Rule, the Ten Commandments, or laws against murder. If an action conforms to a moral rule, then the act is moral. A rule is deemed moral if its existence increases the greater good than any other rule or the absence of such rule. So it's a social level of analysis, not an individual circumstance. You would go through a lot of the same process. What are the utils? Define exactly what you're talking about. Who are impacted. And then some examples might be, does the rule help survival and growth? Does the rule help society become more powerful? Does the rule increase satisfaction and adjustment? Does the rule increase freedom in society? So how can you weigh the good or harm that a rule might do? One is intensity, how strong is the impact? One is duration, how long does the effect last? One is certainty, extent, probability. So there's different ways, different dimensions to the evaluation that you can take on. So what would the procedure be? What is the good and harm in question? What are the utils? Define the stakeholders, who would be helped and harmed. Weigh how important those pleasures, pains, or good harm is compared to, and so that would be the magnitude. What is the probability of that occurrence? And then what are the various rules we can think of and which will produce the best outcomes? You choose the rule that would, you think will have the best outcomes, and then presumably you would evaluate that afterwards. In other words, you would, let's say 10 years later, you would say, okay, well, have things gotten better? Does this seem to have worked out? You still want to make sure that it does, improve things, because that's ultimately the justification or the ethical qualities is based on the outcome. Okay, so the puppy roommate example, what are the utils, feelings of happiness and irritation, how measured, asking people. So what apartment rules might there be um, that will lead to a better outcome over time? One rule is roommates are allowed to bring in animals. That helps people that like puppies. That also will irritate people who don't like puppies. It can lead to conflict, roommates leaving, fights. The owner may not take care of the dog. That could cause damage to the apartment. If you have another rule that no animals are allowed, the potential help is that it keeps the peace in the apartment, and the potential harm that some roommates that want pets are a little frustrated. So it seems like rule 2 might be a better rule for, in general, making for the greater overall happiness in the future. All right, let's talk Rawls' social contract theory. Briefly, I'll go over a background fairly quickly. It's not on the exam. Social contract theory emerged as a way of justifying an ethic or politics or society, or changes in society around the 16 and 1700s, to justify things like the government or various actions outside of the traditional sources of justification or ethics, which would be religion, traditional hierarchies, um, authorities, authoritative figures, and what they said. So instead of simply doing what we've done before and what tradition has taught us, and what people who are traditionally authoritative figures say, we're looking for, in modern society, a new way of justifying things like, what government you should have and things like that. So, Thomas Hobbes is writing in the 1600s during the English Civil War, or near then. And so there's a lot of violence and chaos going around him. And his assumption about human nature, therefore, is the natural state of people is a war of all against all. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. Now, that sounds very unpleasant. In other words, if your neighbor could easily just come over and kill you and there'll be no consequences, you'd have to be fearful all the time. It's a situation in which nothing else in life is possible. In other words, if you're constantly afraid of your life, for your life, then you can't be thinking about careers and relationships and fun and spirituality. You're just trying to survive to the next day. So civil war is the worst situation in any society. And unfortunately, we're still talking about the possibility of civil war. So Hobbes' solution. The idea is a social contract. It's the idea of people experiencing all this fear, and they're going to say, well, we simply all want to solve this problem. How can we do this? And the idea is, well, we're going to pick someone to be the ruler or the Leviathan, and we're going to give up some of our freedom. And in return, that ruler, in return to doing what the ruler says, we are going to be protected by the ruler. So if my neighbor comes over and kills me and takes my stuff, then someone's going to come after him. And so he's likely not to do that. So you're going to be protected. What happened in El Salvador, a president was elected that decided to crack down on the gangs and basically ignored the civil rights of the citizens, but in doing so, he was able to put a lot of gang members in prison and a society that went from the murder capital of the world is now fairly safe. Okay, so that would be one modern example. Later on, Locke is around the 1700s. He's concerned with property. Well, we're all going to agree that we don't want people stealing our stuff. We don't want the government stealing our stuff. We don't want other people stealing our stuff. So let's also agree that the government's going to protect our property, not only our life, but our property. And Locke is someone who heavily influenced our Constitution. This stuff will be on the exam. This is actually the social contract theory of Rawls. So you want to compare this to virtue ethics and the difference between ancient and modern ethics. The ancient philosophy and ethics were grounded in the experience of city-states, small area, limited population, one culture, religion, political structure. Everyone basically shares the same values. The only thing in question is not the values of the culture of the society. It's really how can we make the best decision to pursue those values. It's not what values to pursue. It's how to pursue them, and you want to do that by being virtuous. So the most virtuous person is the one most likely to make the best decision. So that's going to be the ethical decision. Now, modern societies have a huge area of population. They're multicultural. They have many different points of view, languages, standards, preferences, experiences. Slowly, in modern times, the principle of tolerance emerged. There was so much fighting. If you think about the 30 Years' War, 30 years fighting between the Catholics and Protestants in Europe almost destroyed Germany. 40%, it reduced the population by 40%. And at a certain point, the idea of tolerating other religions and then later other ideologies and lifestyles, etc., began to emerge. And so how do you then come to an ethical agreement and ethical grounds if you have no agreement on culture, or preferences or practices? What you do is you build institutions based on a social contract or an agreement on a fair process and accept the outcome. So, for example, you don't try to determine whether the Republicans or the Democrats are the best party, and after determining which is the best, obviously then the ethical thing is to support either the Democrats or the Republican. But instead you say, I don't know. But the thing is, I will accept, on the other hand, the rule of whoever is elected. So I'm relying on the choice of the people, the agreement of the people, in a fair process for elections. You accept the rule of law because there's a fair process. You could disagree with the outcome, but given all the rules and regulations involved in law, you have a fair confidence that the best judgment that could be made was made. How do you determine who should get what? You do that just by the outcome of a fair process, which is free markets. Okay, so what are the aspects of this social contract? It must be freely entered into. Can't be forced into it. And so, let's say you were forced into a union or something like that. That would not be you would not be then obligated to observe that social contract. Um, Everyone should have a fair say in creating those rules, negotiating those rules. A contract typically does not mean like something like a legal, formal, or even a conscious agreement. It's just simply behaving as if the contract exists and benefiting from that contract. In other words, if I join the financial profession, there's certain professional norms that I learn. I follow those norms. If I don't follow them, I get punished. If I do follow them, I get rewarded. I get further in my career. And so by participating in that process and benefiting from it, it's an implied that you have accepted that social contract. Now, it's not permanent. You can always try to renegotiate that contract. Any contract should be realistic, practical, possible, and easily understood. So the idea is not to create a contract that's utopian, like everyone becomes a billionaire. Um, you know, it has to be something that can realistically expected to be followed, expected to be sustainable and possible. So, for example, there was a law against drinking, prohibition in the 20s and 30s. It ended up no one followed the law. No one wanted to, stop drinking. So that was not a useful contract. Why pass a law that no one's going to follow, and which also ultimately created organized crime. I mean, it was impractical. And so the idea is not utopian. It's not fantasy. There's a certain practical ways that people differentiate themselves that produces inequality. Society is naturally hierarchical. You want some inequality. It's a sign of health, of something good happening. You have competition economically, and that shows us who provides the better product, who's more dedicated, who's more intelligent, and then they're more successful. And in the dating market, the person that makes themselves more attractive ends up with a more attractive partner. So it's not utopian. You're not trying to just imagine something. You're being realistic. The perfect should not be the enemy of the good. In other words, your imagined fantasy world is not what we're talking about here. It's a realistic assessment. You are not trying to wish hierarchy away. You're not trying to say that there are no people that need to be advantaged or disadvantaged. In nature, if the hierarchy breaks down, your food chains break down, and a lot of species end up dying. So, one assumption is that the social contract needs to be realistic about how things are, how people are. Now, if you have, let's say, several different contracts that you're thinking about, how do you evaluate which one might be best? One way you can do that is a thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. And what that is it prompts you to imagine, if you didn't know, what the result would be, where you would end up in society. What kind of contract would you create? You would want a contract in which the necessary hierarchy, the lowest people in the necessary hierarchy, are actually get the best outcome. In other words, they get the best result from that. And so if you have two contracts, one in which, you have a social hierarchy in which um, the lowest group actually does better than the other social contract, then the criterion for adjudicating between the two is you're looking at the least advantaged in society. Um, yeah, I guess I'm repeating myself here, but I'll just go through it. Again, the idea is that inequality and hierarchy, in other words, they are actually a sign of a good, healthy society, and they reflect human nature. They reflect actually nature in general. In general, nature works through competition, survival of the fittest, things like that. Okay, so why is that? Well, people have different talents. They have different drives. They have different preferences. They have different motivations. Some people just have good luck or bad luck. And there's going to be different outcomes. Competition, by definition, leads to winners and losers. Um, we all benefit from the various talents. We want people like Elon Musk to do what he's doing and to make more money because he's benefiting us all. We want trying to think of that singer. Stewart, I'm forgetting her name. Well, just think of a singer that makes millions of dollars. We benefit from their talent. We enjoy their work, and they get millions of dollars. And so it seems like it's in a sense good that there's some winners and losers in society. Um, Goes back to the Bible. Whoever has will be given more, and they that have in abundance, and they will have in abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. Okay, so inequality, on the other hand, can be a bad thing. It can produce problems. And so there was an Occupy Wall Street movement protesting the economic collapse of 2008, where the rich and the banks collapsed the whole economy, and there was no consequence. No one went to jail, and the government poured trillions of dollars into helping the banks and let millions of people lose their house. And so that was a reflection of the unequal distribution of power and influence in society. You can have more or less differences in wealth in society. Like Elon Musk is flying to Mars and building spaceships and satellites, buying Twitter, and other people can't buy books for their kids. And so that leads to social unrest, resentment, and conflict. So the natural distribution is neither just nor unjust, nor is it unjust that persons are born into society at some particular position. These are simply natural facts. What is just and unjust is the way that institutions deal with those facts. So you're not trying to be utopian, you're not trying to be ideal, you're not trying to generate a fantasy. You're being very realistic and you're saying, what's the best contract or agreement we can have that will lead to the best outcome? So this quote suggests that inequality is not necessarily a bad thing, but the inequality should be ultimately to everyone's advantage. So if you have an inequality in which, let's say Elon Musk gets all the money, but the garbage man gets absolutely nothing out of it. So Elon Musk, let's say, develops a satellite system and develops trips to the Mars and stuff like that. And he has no opportunity to he gains no advantage from that. Then that would not be a very ethical outcome. On the other hand, the fact is that it's very possible that Elon Musk creates a new car that the garbage man wants to buy, or has the satellite system that gives the garbage man cheap internet access or something like that. And so that inequality actually is justified. And furthermore, freedom of opportunity is also implied in this. So the garbage man's son, for example, should be able to go to better schools and to start their own business and try to compete with everyone else on equal footing. So what Rawls would do is there's 5 steps into this. So again, the ancient ethics is finding a person with the most virtue, whatever they decide is the most ethical thing. Whereas modern ethical philosophies are, well, doesn't matter who you are, you can have no virtue at all, but if you follow these steps, then your decision is probably going to be ethical. So what are the steps for Rawls? Entering into the contract. So people have to be willingly entering into the contract. They have to feel there's a problem to be solved. So Hobbes was talking about the problem of physical security. Locke was talking about the problem of protection of property. Everyone has to enter into the contract, has to agree with it. So if people disagree with the contract, then they're not part of it. They're not obligated to it. It doesn't become an ethic for them. There must be basic conditions for entering in that contract. For example, freedom of speech is probably necessary. Everyone should have an equal opportunity to participate in the negotiations of the contract. The contract must prioritize the welfare of the most disadvantaged. So if you're looking at different contracts, then the one that helps out the most disadvantages is going to be the best one. And then it has to be something that you come to an agreement on, and it lasts for a while. You don't want to renegotiate a contract all the time. So the contract needs to be stable. So if you're evaluating something from a Rawlsian point of view, you would go through these steps. So an example is you have a social contract in higher education, an agreement on social behavior. The student agrees to be cooperative, submits to authority of the professors and administrators, agrees to academic integrity, and contributing to the community. It's going to be friendly to other students and participate and cooperate and helpful. Faculty, they agree to curate the most vital and useful information and to be fair to every student, not to take favorites, and provide the most efficient learning experience. Administration adjudicates conflicts and beliefs. Or, no, adjudicates conflicts and distributes resources and things like that. Okay. Here's a kind of a summary. What are the questions you want to ask in order to do a Rawlsian analysis? Did everyone have an equal opportunity to enter into the process of forming the social contract? Do they have the proper conditions, like the tools, the freedom of speech? Is everyone free to enter the contract without constraints? In other words, if you're forced to enter the union, then that's not a morally binding social contract that you're now part of. Um, did everyone agree on it? If you're forced into a union and then you didn't agree to it, you're not bound by it. Are the least advantaged by this contract given the best situation possible? Is the social contract possible and practical and not utopian or impractical? Does it deal well with the real life constraints and trade offs of the real world and real human nature? And I think I'm repeating this thing here. Okay, does this social contract maximize the welfare of the least advantaged persons, stakeholders? That's the same thing as down here. So I'm repeating that. Does the social contract consider provisions of stability? Will it last over time? Okay, what's the puppy roommate scenario? There's an implicit assumption that the dog is not getting a dog is not an individual right, but must be accepted by everyone in the apartment. So no one actually sat down and talked about this before, but let's just assume that everyone knows that a dog is a big deal. Bringing a dog into the apartment is going to require the consent of everyone, in the apartment. So that there could be a social contract which says, well, if there's anything new coming up, we all have to consent to it. It could be that some people involved in the apartment are not allowed to participate in decision making. They could be subletting or something like that. And so they might not have the rights to. And so, they couldn't participate equally and freely with everyone else, so they're not going to be bound by that contract either. Can participants decide to renegotiate that? So, somebody could say, well, I think the rule should be people should be able to bring in their pets. And then you can have that discussion. So contracts aren't necessarily something that lasts forever and that never change. Is the contract going to actually make things better in the apartment? Is it going to be workable, practical? Are the outcomes going to be better? If you wanted to change the rule to allowing everyone in with pets, then is it easy to find people that will agree to that? If you make a decision about whether to keep the dog or not, will that change if someone wants to keep a cat? Or a different person wants to bring a dog? Maybe one person you dislike wants to bring a dog and you don't like it for that reason, but another person you like wants to bring a dog and you're like, oh, that's fine. So you don't want something that's open to constant renegotiating and changing, and doesn't solve the problem. The problem doesn't go away. You want something that's going to be a rule that everyone can just set and forget. And then finally, ultimately, does the rule over time make everything better? Because if it doesn't, it's going to have to be renegotiated.